In this program, Joseph discusses the divine in religious culture, the mythological role of deities in the universe and within ourselves, the concept embraced by many Native American cultures that all life is divine, the traditional role of the shaman as intermediary between the human and the divine, and the often fine line between divine inspiration and what society views as madness. This conversation took place in February 1981 when Joseph was 77. We began with a question about humankind's relationship to deities. In the Bhagavad Gita, that wonderful document that emerged out of India's past and is so relevant to the present, I want to quote from it. "Whatever path men travel is my path. No matter where they walk, it leads to me. Those who sacrifice to the various deities will go to those deities. The ancestor worshippers will go to their ancestors. Those who worship elemental powers and spirits will go to them. So also my devotees will come to me." That quote, Joseph, just brings to mind that all throughout history and all through the ages, human beings have worshipped a god. And all too often, I think, we put God into some kind of a personal box and call one thing pagan and another thing the truth. What about that from a mythological point of view?
Well, from my point of view, which is based on years of study of mythology, there are two aspects to divinities. One, the divine as a personification of the energies that operate in the universe, and the other as a personification of the energies that operate in ourselves. Now, finally, these are the same energies. And so the deity who is thought of as without is also a reference to what is within. And now, in the different ethnic areas, there is a tendency to think of their vocabulary of deities, their pantheon of deities as being true, and the deities of other people as being false. This is a particularly characteristic attitude of the biblically based religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. When it goes to primitive peoples or to Oriental and archaic religions, that's not the situation usually. There's a tendency to recognize that the deities of this group are equivalent to the deities of that group or of our group. This is particularly conspicuous in the classical world. When Caesar went into Gaul, he wrote in the 6th book of the Gallic Wars about the Celtic religion. But he used the Latin names for the Latin gods to describe the Celtic gods. And when Alexander the Great went into India, his officers recognized in the Indian gods the same gods that they were worshiping. Krishna was identified with Indra, for example. This is known as syncretism, and it seems to me correct. When you confine the truth to your tradition and cut out other people, that gives you a certain privilege in your own mind with respect to them. That is, you have the privilege of knocking them around. But the only way to open up to the contemporary world, where there are no horizons of this kind permissible anymore, is to recognize the deities of other people. And that's the sense of the Bhagavad Gita. That's the sense of all the Oriental teachings, really. The gods are guides to something that we're all being guided to, namely the deep center of knowledge and truth and consciousness and life within ourselves, which is one with that within the world.
I think of the Tibetan Buddhist pantheon of gods and goddesses and deities, all representing a particular aspect of life.
Well, you see, in Tibet, as in certain other parts of the Orient, there was an enormous emphasis on meditation. And the degrees of meditation and the inflections of experience that come through meditation. And each of these inflections had personification. And that's why you get this enormously complex pantheon, because there was an enormously complex tradition of inward experience. Whereas if you don't go inward like that and have all these varieties of experience, then such deities don't mean anything to you. The Tibetan pantheon in its fullness would not mean anything to a Western person because he hadn't had the counterpart experiences. But a monk who spent his whole life meditating, and then translating those into verbal and image statements is in tune with that pantheon.
Is there something of psychological understanding to be learned from that pantheon as relative, say, to our understanding of psychology in the West?
Well, for some of the major figures of the pantheon, that's true. But for the exquisite inflection, that's not true. There's a certain mistake in trying to become, let's say, a Tibetan or a Japanese or a Hindu if you are a Western person. What you ought to learn from them is to seek the equivalent mysteries in yourself. But then your own folk idea system has to come through. Everyone has to be creative in his own way, and one can lose oneself. Remember, I spoke earlier of entering the path where there was no path. You say, entering the forest where it was dark. When you enter someone else's path, you're apt to get displaced and achieve a false realization.
Yeah, when we look around, we see religion after religion, group after group, where there is a teacher and a disciple relationship, the teacher and the student, and this is the path, follow the path, do this, do it this way, meditate this way, meditate that way, pray this way, pray that way. You're suggesting that it should be otherwise.
I'm suggesting that it should be otherwise. I think you can take clues from teachers. I know you can. But you see, the traditional Oriental idea is that the student should submit absolutely to the teacher. The guru actually assumes responsibility for the student's moral life. And this is a total giving. I don't think that's quite proper for a Western person. I think one of the big spiritual truths of the West is that each of us is a unique creature and consequently has a unique path. You can take suggestions. I've gone in my life from one teacher to another, not mystery teachers, not spiritual teachers, but teachers in learning, and I leave them behind, just as we leave the music behind that we loved in our childhood for the music of later times, and each finding his own way. There are plenty of guides around, but none should be permitted to say, I'm it. Now, when Jesus and Krishna, in the text that you've just read, say, all come only through me, what they're saying really is that they themselves represent that inward truth in oneself that must be found, and that is the gate. And I think if you read this concretely as meaning you've got to follow so-and-so, namely me, it's being misread. The me that they're talking to is the Christ in us, the God in us, and they're pointing toward it. There's that wonderful little Japanese Zen sign of the finger pointing to the moon. You must mistake the finger for the moon, and that the doctrine must not be mistaken and concretize and say, this is exactly it. It's not Jesus who's speaking, but Jesus Christ. The Christ is the second person of the Blessed Trinity, which is the knower of God the Father, and that's what's within us to be brought to life. As Paul could say, I live now, not I, but Christ in me. And so also Krishna can live in one.
Joseph, one of the things you've done in your life, and I never cease to be amazed at the volume of material that you've turned out through your hands in writing, and you edited the portable Jung, and you put a lot of Jung's writings together, and you were just talking about how it's important to see our own uniqueness as Westerners and to come in touch with that and to perhaps learn from the East, but we also have our own individual understanding to realize and recognize. And I recall Jung visited the Taos Indians of New Mexico in the 1920s when he was able to talk with some of the elders with their ancient understanding of who their gods were and what an influence this had on Jung as a Westerner, as someone who was exploring the psyche in very deep ways. And I'd like you to talk about that.
Well, I can talk a little bit about my own experience of the American Indian world. It was through, as a young boy, reading American Indian stories and learning something about them, while I was at the same time being educated as a Roman Catholic, that I came to a realization that has stayed with me ever since. And it's a realization that I think can be well coordinated with my Catholic training, but it has a somewhat different emphasis. What I realized from the Indians was that all life was for them divine. The whole world was not simply the production of God, but was the actual manifestation of a divine power, the Wakan or Render or Manitou or whatever it was that was manifesting. And that wonderful thing that you learn when you read of the Indian sacred pipe ceremonial, where they hold the stem of the pipe up for the sun to smoke it first, and then present it to the four directions, and then bring it to themselves, and they have centered themselves in this divine world. A buffalo skull as a sacred object, the animal that is the source of their nourishment being itself a willing victim. And when they say their grace before meals, it's not to an image of God somewhere else thanking him for letting them kill this animal. It's to the animal for having given its life. You know, that wonderful I-thou relationship between the individual and the universe was to me a marvelous revelation and stays with me. And this was something that struck Jung also, as I recall I had a conversation with Jung, and I've also read a good deal of his own writings about things of this kind. It's something in quite a contrary position to that of the one who thinks, well, the divine is God out there, and he created the world, and the world is not God, but it's a manifestation of God's power and marvel and all that kind of thing. It's a different slant. But this got into me, and this, I think, is the mystical line, as opposed rather to the orthodox institutionalized religious position. It comes out also in that wonderful book that John Neihart wrote, Black Elk Speaks, where Black Elk tells of a vision that he had had when he was 9 years old. It was a prophetic vision of what was going to happen to his people. But there's a moment there where he says, I saw myself standing on the central mountain of the world. The central mountain of the world is Harney Peak in South Dakota. And then immediately he said, but the central mountain is everywhere. Now, there is a man who understood symbolism, understood cult, and understood the reference. If you want to go to the central mountain of the world, and you are a Sioux Indian, perhaps you should go to Harney Peak. But perhaps you should go to Jerusalem. Perhaps you should go to Rome. Perhaps you should go to Lhasa. Or perhaps you shouldn't go anywhere, but realize that the real central mountain is in yourself, and that this is the cult symbol to put your mind in touch with the idea of a central mountain. The central mountain is the same as the immovable spot under which the Buddha sat. The central mountain is the same as the cross of Christ on the Mount of the Skull, Calvary. This is the same thing, and it's right in yourself. That's where it is. This is what that man knew, that American Indian shaman. And it's this kind of wisdom that comes out of simple people, what seem to us to be simple people, non-literate people, non-complicated people, that can open your eyes to the teaching of your own most elaborate tradition, whatever it may be.
Joseph, you were talking about the Indians, and it just brings to mind, again, in looking at the American Indian culture, the role of the medicine man, and it just occurs to me that we don't have medicine men in the same way that we once had them, or the American Indian had them.
Well, the medicine man was primarily one who had had a profound psychological experience in adolescence. Let's say the shaman, what's known as the shaman crisis. It's a marvelous subject, this one of shamanism. Typically, the person in early youth is alone, let's say walking on the seashore or in the forest, and hears a strange music. And it's the music of the spirits talking to him. and a relationship becomes established. And he's got to hold on to that relationship, otherwise he loses his life. Sometimes what's put upon him is a difficult life, and the shaman's life was a difficult one of deep psychological responsibilities and experiences which he himself hardly understood. This is really a form of mystical experience, experiencing areas of energy that are beyond the conscious knowledge.
Again, I think of other societies and cultures, and particularly in the Americas, that have ritually used drugs, hallucinogenic plants, and et cetera. And in our culture, we have this incredible drug abuse problem, and it is to some extent due to the fact that we've lost the ritual use of those substances, which really can be used in a way that expands our consciousness as opposed to making us go crazy.
Well, I imagine something could be said for that. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but thinking of the way in which drugs have been used and hallucinogens throughout the Americas and the American Indian systems is full of it. This Castaneda brought out. We know a good deal about that now in the Americas. Also shamanism in the North Siberian area, but also in India. When you see the dancing Shiva, that leaf that's in his hair, that leaf-shaped thing, is the hallucinogenic plant, the datura plant. So through vision, one comes to the knowledge of some things within oneself. We've cut that out, and I suppose...
We have the ritual of the cocktail party is about the extent of the ritual we have associated with the drugs in our culture.
Well, that's the sense, of T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party, that the performance of the rituals of society can be a religious performance. And in our world, it's not only going to church, but it's also giving a cocktail party that's a religious act. Well, this puts us on a plane with the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, where every act of life, every relationship of life can be experienced mythologically as symbolic of a religious experience. One finds going into an Indian home as a guest, one is treated almost as a god. The guest is a deity. I mean, that's a religious act, receiving a guest. It's always been thought to be so. The Arab culture is full of this. The guest is under your protection, absolutely, and in the medieval and in the classical tradition as well. And so taking care of your child is a religious act. There's a story connected with Ramakrishna, the great Indian saint of the last century, where a woman came to him and said, Master, I have to admit, I don't love God. This idea has not, as we might say today, grabbed me, Well, he said, is there nothing in the world that you love? And she said, why, yes, I love my little nephew. And he said, there he is. Taking care of him, you are fostering the God principle within yourself.
It's interesting you bring up Ramakrishna. Perhaps if Ramakrishna were around today and emerged, say, in Washington, D.C., they'd probably lock him up very quickly.
Well, he had certain ways of behavior, at least during the time of his sadhana, during the time of his breakthrough into full realizations. He behaved in a quite insane way at times. There were 2 or 3 periods in his life when he was really mad for God. And such a person would be treated as insane. And then the adventure would be aborted. They'd give him drugs and things to blow it out, instead of letting it go through the ceremony.
And here's a man who's acknowledged by millions of people as an incarnation of God.
Well, what he had to say was beautiful. I mean, that book that Swami Nikhilananda translated into English, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, it's a beautiful, beautiful experience to read that.
Also, of course, in Tibet, prior to Padmasambhava's arrival, who is acknowledged as bringing Buddhism to Tibet, there was the bone religion, which was the worship of nature spirits and nature mysticism. And you find parts of that obviously ancient bone nature mysticism in Tibetan Buddhism.
Well, the two interact. One characteristic of Buddhism, you see, that is in contrast to that of Christianity as a missionizing religion, is that Buddhism does not eliminate the deities that were there before. It says these deities are manifestation of Buddha consciousness in the mode of this culture. and so they keep them. In Japan, I heard that when the MacArthur people took a census of religious beliefs in Japan, they found that there were more religious believers than there were people in Japan, because everybody was both a Shinto and Buddhist believer. The local deities are manifestations. Well, the Franciscan monks over here in America had somewhat of that too. These people who are dancing the dances in the pueblos, the pueblo dancers, they're Catholics. There's the church right there, and there's the primitive, earlier religious system as well. And that kind of thing is it's a powerful force, because the old religion is not refuted thereby. It is sublimated, you might say, and its energies are brought into the new.
I wanted to return, Joseph, to one of the points you were making about the literally amazing capacity of Buddhism to place itself in literally any culture and become a part of that culture, and honor and acknowledge the culture of which it becomes a part. It's quite extraordinary compared to other religions.
Yes, well, it's based on a fundamental Buddhist thought, namely that Buddha consciousness is ubiquitous, is everywhere. And the goal of Buddhism is to make the individual aware of the Buddha being, the Buddha consciousness in himself. Also, it accepts what the world produces and gives. I spent about 3 years helping a Tibetan monk write his autobiography. This was about 8 years ago. And he had been a tulku, that is, one who was regarded as a reincarnation of a monk who'd been reincarnating since the 16th century. And he was taken into the monastery when he was about 5 years old, and so his whole life was spent in the monastery. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. And he left Tibet exactly the day the Dalai Lama did. He was in Lhasa, and he was actually at the Dalai Lama's summer palace called the Nabulinka at the time of the communist bombarding of the palace and attempt to take the Dalai Lama and the Dalai Lama's flight, and then the massacre of people in Lhasa and all this kind of thing. It's a hideous story. The departure from Tibet. His teachers had been tortured and murdered, and his schoolmates and friends and so forth, monastery companions. And I've never heard a negative word about the Chinese from that man. I've never heard a negative word of what had happened from that man. It is all Buddha process. And there's that Buddhist idea of what's called mutual arising. Enemies arise mutually, and the situations are of a transcendent source. And I learned from him what religion is. It's a perfectly beautiful thing. Unfortunately, when his book was published, the publisher massacred it, took the whole guts out of it, and just gave us the beginning and the end. Whereas the great thing about the book was it's telling us of all the details of monastery life in Tibet, which now is finished and we'll know nothing about otherwise.
It brings to mind, as you're talking about that acceptance of, again, the relationship in ourselves between accepting and the wanting to control.
Oh, that's the whole mystery. To have the mind submit, it must try to serve, not dominate life. That's a major point in so many mythologies. The mind dominating life is really Satan, and life speaking through the mind is the power of the Christ. That's a basic thing. It's the Buddha theme as well.
We have things like wanting to control our environment.
Our relationship to the environment is a bad one because it's been one of exploitation, and we're suffering from that now. I think something's happening. People are beginning to realize there's a dialogue between civilization and its landscape that must be recognized. I think it's beginning to get into the mind now, what's called the ecological movement. It's something that's being realized a little late, and I think not too late.
I want to thank you for being with us, Joseph.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I feel I'm talking to a brother.